I suspect that my pregnant wife may have had an affair with her coworker. The clock read 2:47 a.m. when Jason rolled over to find the bed empty. A chill ran through him as his hand met the cold, undisturbed sheets on Emma's side. It wasn't the first time he'd woken to find her missing in the night. In the past few weeks, she'd grown distant, her once warm laughter now replaced with vacant smiles and hollow eyes. At first, he chalked it up to the pregnancy, hormones, fatigue, the weight of impending parenthood. But the whispers of doubt grew louder each night she was gone. He found her in the kitchen, staring blankly out the window, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She didn't hear him approach, too lost in her thoughts. When he softly called her name, she flinched, nearly dropping her phone. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle, cautious. "Yeah, just the baby," she murmured, placing a protective hand over her belly. "Restless, I guess?" Jason studied her face. The faint shadow of worry etched between her brows. She looked like she wanted to say something, but then she forced a smile, a brittle one. "I'll be back to bed soon." He nodded, his heart heavy as he returned to the cold bed alone. As sleep eluded him, his mind spiraled back to that nagging suspicion. It wasn't just the late nights. It was the way she guarded her phone, how her laughter had become scarce, how she mentioned her coworker Mark's name just a bit too often. Mark, the guy she always spoke highly of, the one who gave her a ride home from the office party because she didn't want Jason to go out of his way. The one she said made her job more bearable. Jason tried to shake off the thought. They were having a baby, for God's sake. They were building a life together. Yet the unease clung to him like damp fog. The next morning, as Emma left for work, Jason couldn't resist the urge to check her phone. He hated himself for it, but the unanswered questions gnawed at him. To his frustration, the phone was locked, with a new passcode. It felt like confirmation of his worst fears. Determined to find out the truth, Jason visited her office under the guise of taking her out for lunch. He made casual conversation with her coworkers, trying to sound nonchalant. As he brought up Mark. "He's out today," one of her colleagues mentioned. "He's been taking a lot of personal days lately. Heard his wife's expecting too." Jason's heart sank. He hadn't known Mark was married, much less expecting a child. Why had Emma never mentioned that? As he watched her laugh with her team, he wondered how much of the woman he loved had become a stranger to him. That night, Emma was distant again, barely touching her dinner. When Jason asked if everything was all right, she looked at him with such sadness that his heart broke. But before he could press further, she excused herself, heading to bed early. Desperation drove him to hire a private investigator the next day. It felt wrong, intrusive, but the need for answers outweighed his guilt. If she was cheating, he needed to know. If she wasn't, then maybe he could finally put his suspicions to rest and focus on being the husband and father he wanted to. Days passed with little to report. The investigator followed Emma to work, to her doctor's appointments, to lunch with her girlfriends. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Jason began to question his sanity, wondering if his jealousy was playing tricks on him. Then, one evening, the investigator called with a strained voice. "We need to meet. There's something you need to see." They met at a dimly lit diner on the edge of town. The man slid an envelope across the table, his expression grave. Inside were photos of Emma with Mark. They were at a cafe, leaning close, faces tense with emotion. In the next shot, Mark's hand rested on Emma's arm, his expression one of pleading. In another, she was wiping away tears. The last photo was the most damning. Mark's arms wrapped around her as she rested her head on his shoulder. Jason's stomach lurched. It was intimate. Too intimate. But the tears on Emma's face didn't look like those of a woman in love. They looked like pain, like guilt. Did you follow them after? Jason asked, his voice tight. The investigator shook his head. They went their separate ways. But I did some digging. Mark's wife. She lost the baby last month. Complications. The room spun as Jason processed the revelation. Emma wasn't having an affair. She was comforting a friend whose world had fallen apart. But why hadn't she told him? Why keep it a secret? That night, Jason confronted her, unable to hold back his anguish. Why didn't you tell me about Mark's wife? About the baby? Emma's face crumpled, tears spilling over. Because I felt guilty, she choked out. I'm carrying our baby while they lost theirs. Every time I saw Mark's pain, I felt so ashamed of my happiness. I didn't want to burden you with that. Life slowly found its rhythm again after the storm of doubt and grief. Yet the echoes of Jason's suspicions lingered, shadows that occasionally clouded his thoughts. Trust, once broken, even if by misunderstanding, wasn't easily mended. Emma sensed it too. She moved through their home with a delicate caution, as if afraid of breaking whatever fragile peace they had rebuilt. They danced around each other, careful with words, mindful of boundaries they never thought would exist between them. One evening, as Jason cradled baby Grace in his arms, her tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb, he glanced over at Emma. She was watching him with a look that melted his heart. Tenderness, love, and a hint of fear. He took a deep breath, setting Grace down in her crib. "We need to talk," he said, his voice gentle but firm. Emma looked away, her shoulders tensing. "About what?" "About us. About everything that happened." He paused, searching for the right words. "I thought I was losing you. It terrified me. I let that fear twist into suspicion, but I don't want to live with that shadow over us." Her eyes welled with tears, and she hugged herself as if bracing for a blow. "I never meant to shut you out. I was just so lost in the guilt. I felt like I was betraying Mark and his wife just by being happy." Jason crossed the room, gently turning her to face him. "I should have been there for you, but instead, I let my insecurities push us apart." He took her hands, his voice breaking. "I want to fix this, Emma. I want us back." She let out a shaky breath, her fingers tightening around his. "I want that too. But how do we move past this?" They started by being painfully honest. Jason told her about the private investigator, about the photos that broke his heart and the relief that followed. Emma admitted to the nights she spent awake, tormented by the fear that her happiness was undeserved. They cried together, raw and vulnerable, unearthing every doubt, every hurt, every silent wound they had buried. It wasn't easy. Some nights the pain resurfaced, leading to quiet arguments or heavy silences. But they kept fighting for each other. They went to couples therapy, learning how to communicate without judgment, how to rebuild trust, brick by fragile brick. Jason stopped flinching every time her phone buzzed. Emma stopped hiding her tears, letting him hold her through the moments of guilt and grief. They started laughing again, real laughter that filled their home with warmth and hope. One night, as they watched Grace sleep, Emma leaned her head on Jason's shoulder. "Do you still think about it?" she asked softly. Jason hesitated but chose the truth. "Sometimes. But then I remember that you chose me. You chose us. And that's enough." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with gratitude and love. "We'll be okay, won't we?" He kissed her forehead, pulling her close. "Yeah, we will. Because we're choosing to be." Months passed, and the shadows grew fainter. Mark and his wife moved on, eventually finding healing in a new city. Jason and Emma stayed in touch, their friendship a bittersweet reminder of loss and hope intertwined. On Grace's first birthday, They stood together, watching their daughter giggle. As she smashed cake with her tiny hands, Jason slipped his arm around Emma's waist, his heart swelling with love. They had faced the darkness, broken and rebuilt themselves, and emerged stronger than before. He whispered into her hair, "I'll never stop fighting for us." Emma smiled, resting her head on his chest. "And I'll never stop choosing you." They stayed like that, wrapped in each other's arms, watching Grace's innocent joy. The past still lingered, a distant echo, but the future stretched before them, bright, hopeful, and theirs to shape. They weren't perfect, but they were together. And that was more than enough. Years went by, and life continued its steady march forward. Grace grew into a curious, spirited child, with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness. Jason and Emma welcomed another child, a boy they named Liam, whose laughter filled every corner of their home. Their family wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs. They built new memories, shared new joys, and faced new challenges, always together. But even as life blossomed around them, the shadows of the past never fully disappeared. Jason would sometimes catch himself overanalyzing a harmless text on Emma's phone, or Emma would see a look of doubt flicker in his eyes. Old wounds had left scars, reminders of how close they had come to losing everything. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jason spoke the thought that had been haunting him. "Do you ever regret staying with me? After everything we went through?" Emma looked at him, surprised. "Why would you ask that?" "I don't know," he admitted, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Sometimes I wonder if you deserved better. If you deserved someone who never doubted you." She took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "We both made mistakes, Jason. But we chose to stay. We chose to fight. That's what matters." He looked into her eyes, seeing the truth reflected there. She meant it. She had forgiven him, just as he had forgiven her. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold, feeling the weight of the past slowly lifting. But the past had one last twist to reveal. A week later, Jason received a message from an unknown number. It was a photo, grainy, taken from a distance, but unmistakable. It was Emma, at a cafe, sitting across from Mark. His heart raced, the old fear clawing its way back. He forced himself to breathe, to think rationally. There could be an innocent explanation. There had to be. That evening, he showed Emma the photo. Her eyes widened, and she looked at him with panic. "Jason, it's not what you think." "What am I supposed to think?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why didn't you tell me?" Emma sat down, rubbing her temples. "Mark reached out a few weeks ago. He wanted closure. He said he couldn't move on until he made peace with what happened." Jason swallowed hard, fighting the jealousy and fear rising within him. "And you believed him?" She looked up, her eyes pleading. "I owed him that much. I never meant to keep it from you. I just didn't want to reopen old wounds." The hurt was raw, fresh, threatening to break him all over again. "Did you meet him more than once?" She hesitated. "Twice. The first time we barely spoke." "The second time? He apologized. We both said our goodbyes. It's over, Jason. I swear." He wanted to believe her, but the past was a cruel echo, reminding him of how easily doubt could grow. "Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me?" Tears filled her eyes. "Because I was scared. Scared that you'd think I still had feelings for him. Scared that we'd go back to that place where nothing I said was enough." Jason closed his eyes, the pain twisting inside him. "I can't go through that again, Emma." She moved closer, her voice breaking. "Then don't. Believe me this time." Trust that I chose you, that I will always choose you. He looked at her, seeing the fear, the love, the desperate hope in her eyes. He realized that they were both still healing, still learning how to trust again. He took her hand, holding it tightly. No more secrets, no more lies. She nodded, tears spilling over. No more. They sat there, holding on to each other, vowing to fight the shadows together. They weren't perfect. Their love wasn't flawless, but it was real. And it was worth saving. This time, they would face the darkness side by side. No more doubts, no more ghosts. Only truth, only love, only them. The days that followed were tense, heavy with the weight of unspoken fears and fragile hopes. Jason and Emma were careful with each other, navigating conversations with delicate precision, afraid of reopening old wounds. Yet, despite the unease, they kept their promise. No more secrets, no more lies. They began attending counseling sessions again, confronting the lingering shadows of doubt that had threatened to tear them apart. The counselor guided them through painful conversations, forcing them to confront not just their fears, but also the guilt and insecurities they had buried. Jason admitted his struggle with jealousy, the way his mind sometimes replayed old suspicions, even when he desperately wanted to trust her. Emma confessed her fear of being judged, of her past mistakes defining her in his eyes forever. It was raw. It was brutal. But it was necessary. Slowly, painfully, they started to rebuild. They shared, more than just words. They shared their fears, their hopes, their dreams for the future. They learned to trust again, even when it was hard, even when it hurt. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching Grace and Liam play, Jason looked over at Emma, his heart full. "I love you," he whispered. She turned to him, her eyes shining, with tears. "I love you too, and I'm never letting go." They sealed the promise with a kiss, feeling the weight of the past begin to lift. But the past wasn't finished with them yet. A month later, Jason received another message from the unknown number. This time, it was a video. His heart sank as he watched the grainy footage of Emma hugging Mark outside the cafe, the embrace lingering a little too long. His world shattered, the doubts flooding back, more powerful than before. He confronted Emma that night, his voice breaking as he showed her the video. "You said it was over. You said goodbye." Emma's face went pale, her eyes wide with shock. "Jason, I did. I swear." "Then why does this look like more than goodbye?" His voice cracked, the pain raw and unfiltered. Tears streamed down her face. "I don't know. I don't even remember that moment. It was just a hug. A goodbye hug. You have to believe me." But Jason couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in, the old fears rising like shadows ready to consume him. "I want to believe you. But I can't. Not after everything." Emma reached for him, her hands trembling. "Please, Jason, I've told you everything. There's nothing more to hide." He pulled away, his heart breaking. "I need time. I need space." He left that night, driving aimlessly, trying to make sense of the chaos in his mind. The trust they had painstakingly rebuilt crumbled to dust, replaced by pain and betrayal. Days passed in silence. Jason stayed with his brother, avoiding Emma's calls, drowning in confusion and heartache. He wanted to believe her, to trust her, but his mind replayed the video over and over, each time more damning than the last. Then, one night, his phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. This time, it was a text. "She's lying to you. She never stopped seeing him." Jason's blood ran cold. He dialed the number, but it was disconnected. He sent a message, demanding to know who it was, but received no response. Desperate for answers, he called the private investigator once more. Find out who's sending these messages. I need the truth. It took a week for the investigator to call back. Jason's heart raced as he answered. What did you find? The man hesitated before speaking. It's Mark. He's been sending you those messages. And the photos. He's trying to break you two up. Jason's world spun. What? Why? He never got over her. He's been trying to sabotage your marriage, hoping she'd leave you and go back to him. Rage and relief warred within Jason. He had been played, twisted, and manipulated by Mark's jealousy and obsession. The video, the photos, all calculated moves to destroy his trust in Emma. His hands trembled as he drove home, his heart pounding. Emma was in the living room when he walked in, her face pale and eyes red from crying. She stood up, fear flickering across her face. Jason. He crossed the room in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms. I'm so sorry. I was wrong. I should have trusted you. I should have believed you. She broke down, sobbing against his chest. I thought I lost you. I thought we were over. He held her tighter, his own tears falling. No, never. Not again. I'm done letting the past control us. I'm done doubting you. They stayed, like that for a long time, holding each other, healing together. The next day, Jason confronted Mark. He stood outside Mark's office, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. When Mark saw him, his face went pale. Jason's voice was cold, steady. You tried to ruin my family. You tried to take her from me. Mark looked away, shame written all over his face. I loved her first. I thought if you left, she'd come back to me. Jason took a step closer, his eyes burning with fury. Months passed, and life began to feel normal again. Jason and Emma settled into their routines, laughter returning to their home, shadows of doubt replaced by warmth and trust. They attended counseling regularly, determined to keep their communication open, their bond strong. The day finally arrived when Emma went into labor. It was chaotic, intense, and beautiful. Jason stood by her side, holding her hand, whispering words of encouragement as she brought their son into the world. When the doctor placed the baby in Emma's arms, tears filled Jason's eyes. He looked at his wife, her face glowing with joy, and then at their newborn son, tiny, perfect, and undeniably his. The weight of the past, all the fears and insecurities, melted away in that moment. They named him Noah, a symbol of new beginnings and hope. As they took Noah home, Grace and Liam were ecstatic, doting on their little brother, their laughter filling the house with joy. Jason couldn't believe how lucky he was. His family was complete, his heart full. One evening, as he stood by Noah's crib, watching his son sleep, Emma wrapped her arms around him from behind. He looks just like you, she whispered, resting her head on his shoulder. Jason smiled, his heart swelling. Yeah, he does. They stood there in silence, holding each other, feeling more connected than ever. But life, as they knew too well, was never without its twists. A few weeks later, Jason received a letter in the mail. It was unmarked, no return address. Curious, he opened it, his brow furrowing as he read the neatly typed words. You think it's over, but it's not. You don't know the full story. She's still lying to you. His blood ran cold. The past he thought they had left behind came rushing back, shadows creeping in once more. He looked up at Emma, who was laughing with Grace and Liam in the living room, her face full of love and light. Could it be true? Was there more to the story, or was this just another cruel attempt to tear them apart? Jason crumpled the letter in his fist, his jaw tightening. He was done letting doubt control his life, but he also knew he couldn't ignore this. Not again. He needed answers, once and for all. His journey wasn't over. The truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. And this time, he wouldn't stop until he found it, even if it shattered him all over again. Jason couldn't sleep that night. The words from the letter echoed in his mind, gnawing at him like a relentless itch he couldn't scratch. She's still lying to you? Who would send this? And why now? Just when they were finally happy, just when he had begun to trust again. His gaze shifted to Emma, peacefully asleep beside him, her face serene, illuminated by the moonlight slipping through the curtains. Was it possible? Could she still be hiding something? He hated himself for even thinking it. But the doubts, once planted, took root. The next day, Jason took the letter to the only person he could trust outside of his family, Michael. They met at their usual spot, a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. Michael examined the letter, his face hardening. No return address. Printed, not handwritten. Whoever sent this didn't want to be traced. Jason ran a hand through his hair. I don't know what to believe. Everything's been good. Better than ever, actually. But then this, Michael leaned in, his voice low. Who would want to mess with you like this? Do you think it could be someone from her work? Jason's jaw clenched. Daniel's gone. Emma hasn't even mentioned him since we found out about Noah. Michael looked unconvinced. Are you sure? People like him don't just disappear. A chill ran down Jason's spine. He remembered Daniel's smug face, the way he'd acted so sure of himself, so confident that he knew something Jason didn't. I thought we were past all of this, Jason muttered. Michael's eyes were steely. You need to find out for sure. Otherwise, this is going to eat at you. Again. Jason knew he was right, but he didn't want to accuse Emma without proof, not after everything they'd been through. He had to do this carefully, without her knowing. I'll look into it, Jason said, his voice firm. But I can't let her find out. Not yet. Michael nodded. I've got a friend. Private investigator. Discreet. He can check things. Out without raising any red flags. Jason hesitated. He hated the idea of spying on his wife, but he needed the truth, one way or another. Set it up, he said, his voice heavy with resolve. I need to know who sent this, and why. For the next few days, Jason played his part perfectly. He was the doting husband, the loving father, helping Emma with Noah and playing with Grace and Liam as if nothing was wrong. But every time Emma smiled at him, the words from the letter echoed in his mind. It took a week for the investigator, Tom Riley, to get back to him. They met late. At night in Michael's office, the room dimly lit, shadows dancing on the walls. Riley's face was grim. I traced the letter back to a private mailbox service downtown, paid for in cash. No way to track who sent it. Jason's shoulders slumped. So, it's a dead end? Riley shook his head. Not exactly. I also looked into Daniel like you asked. He slid a folder across the table. Turns out he didn't just disappear. He was fired for misconduct, harassment charges, and not just from Emma. Jason's eyes widened as he flipped through the documents. There were statements from 3 different women, all detailing similar experiences of inappropriate behavior and manipulation. Riley continued, I spoke to a few people from the company. Word is he blames Emma for losing his job. Claims she set him up. He's been telling anyone who'd listen that she's a liar, and that the baby isn't yours. Jason's blood ran cold. He's still in town. Yeah, laying low, but he's around, and he's angry, real angry. Michael's fist hit the table. That son of a... Jason stopped him. If he's the one behind this, then he won't stop until he ruins us. I need to end this, for good. Riley leaned back, his eyes calculating. Then you need to confront him. Make him admit what he's doing, but be careful. A guy like that, he's dangerous. Jason looked down at the folder, Daniel's smug face staring back at him from a company photo. All the fear, all the doubt, everything that had haunted him for months, it all led back to this man. He stood up, his fists clenched. "I'm done letting him control my life. I'm ending this. Now." Michael put a hand on his shoulder. "You're not doing it alone." Jason's eyes were hard as steel. "I'm getting the truth, once and for all." As he walked out into the cold night, his heart pounded with a mix of anger and fear. He was ready to face Daniel, ready to confront the man who had tried to destroy his family. But Jason had no idea just how deep Daniel's grudge ran, or how far he was willing to go for revenge. The truth was coming, but it would come at a cost Jason never saw coming. The next evening, Jason drove to the seedy motel on the outskirts of town where Daniel was staying. The place was a rundown relic, its neon sign flickering ominously in the dark. It was the kind of place where people went to disappear. Michael insisted on coming along, waiting in the car just in case things went sideways. Jason didn't argue. He knew how dangerous Daniel could be. His heart pounded as he climbed the creaking steps to room 214. He knocked hard, fists tight, ready for whatever confrontation awaited him. The door swung open, revealing Daniel. He looked worse than Jason remembered. Disheveled hair, bloodshot eyes, a week's worth of stubble on his face. But his arrogant smirk was the same. "Well, well. Look who finally decided to show up," Daniel drawled, leaning against the doorframe. "I was wondering when you'd grow a spine." Jason's jaw tightened. "Cut the crap, we need to talk." Daniel laughed, a low, mocking sound. "I don't think we have anything to discuss. Your wife made sure of that when she ruined my life." Jason pushed past him, stepping into the grimy room. The stench of alcohol and stale smoke hit him like a punch. "This ends now. You sent that letter, didn't you?" Daniel shut the door, his expression hardening. "You think I give a damn about your little family? You have no idea what she did." Jason's hands curled into fists. "Stop playing games. You've been trying to break us apart from the start. But it didn't work. We're stronger than ever. You lost." Daniel's eyes flashed with anger. He grabbed a half-empty bottle from the table, his fingers white-knuckled around the neck. "You think this is about losing? You took everything. From me!" Jason took a step forward, his voice cold. "No. You did that to yourself. Harassing women, manipulating people. Emma wasn't the only one who reported you. She just had the courage to stand up to you." Daniel's face twisted with rage. "Courage? Is that what you call it? She lied. She lied to all of you. To me. To you. She played us both." Jason's blood ran cold. "What the hell are you talking about?" Daniel's laugh was hollow, bitter. "You don't know, do you? She never told you why she was so close to me. Why she trusted me with all those late-night meetings. All those secrets." Jason's heart pounded. "She said it was work. She said she was trying to get ahead, to provide for our family." Daniel's eyes gleamed with cruel satisfaction. She was protecting herself, covering her tracks. "Did she tell you about the audit? About the money that went missing under her watch?" Jason's breath caught in his throat. "You're lying." "Am I?" Daniel took a swig from the bottle, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "She begged me to keep quiet, said she'd do anything to make it go away." He leaned in, his voice low and taunting. "And she did." Jason's world spun. His knees felt weak. "No, she wouldn't. She wouldn't do that." Daniel's grin was pure malice. "She's not as perfect as you think. She used me. And then she threw me to the wolves to save herself." His eyes turned cold, his voice dripping with venom. "She's the reason I lost my job, my career, everything. And you just took her. Back. Like a fool." Jason's head was spinning, his mind racing through everything he thought he knew. The late nights, the evasive answers, the tears. Was it all a lie? He stumbled back, his back hitting the wall. "You're just trying to mess with my head, to get back at her, at me." Daniel's face darkened. "Believe whatever you want. But the truth is staring you in the face. She betrayed you, just like she betrayed me. Jason's stomach churned. He wanted to hit Daniel, to shut him up, to stop the poison from seeping into his mind. But he couldn't move. He couldn't. Breathe. Daniel's voice softened, almost pitying. Face it, Jason. She's not who you think she is. She never was. Jason turned and stumbled out of the room, his vision blurred, his heart pounding. He barely registered Michael calling his name, the concerned look on his face. All he could see was Emma's face smiling at him, lying to him. Again, the drive home was a blur. By the time he walked through the front door, his hands were shaking, his mind racing. He found Emma in the nursery, rocking Noah to sleep, her face soft and serene. She looked up at him, her eyes full of love and warmth. Hey, you're home late. Everything okay? He stared at her, his heart breaking all over again. Was this all just an act? Was she playing him, even now? He forced himself to smile. Yeah, everything's fine. But his world was falling apart. Again. And this time, he didn't know if he could put it back together. The cold night air stung Jason's face as he stumbled down the driveway, his vision blurred by tears he refused to let fall. His chest felt hollow, every breath aching. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't be in that house. Couldn't stand to look at her. Her sobs echoed in his mind, haunting him, tearing at his resolve. Was she truly sorry, or just sorry she'd been caught? He drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring past as his thoughts raced. The betrayal ran so deep, tangled in layers of lies, deception, and half-truths. It wasn't just the affair with Daniel. It was the cover-up, the fraud, the shattered trust. Eventually, he found himself at Michael's doorstep, numb and exhausted. Michael opened the door, his face etched with concern. He didn't say a word, just stepped aside, letting Jason in. They sat in silence for a while, the quiet heavy with unspoken pain. Finally, Jason spoke, his voice hollow. She admitted it. All of it. She said she was trying to protect me, to protect us. Michael's jaw tightened. That's not protection. That's betrayal. Jason's shoulders sagged. I keep asking myself, was any of it real? Did she ever love me, or was it all a lie? Michael sighed, his eyes heavy with sympathy. I don't have the answers, man, but I know she's been lying to you for a long time. You deserve better than that, Jason laughed bitterly. I don't even know what's real anymore. Michael's gaze hardened. You need to confront Daniel, make him tell you the truth, every ugly detail, no more secrets. A cold fire ignited in Jason's chest. He needed answers, closure. He needed to face the man who had destroyed his Afne. The next morning, Jason drove to Daniel's office, his heart pounding, fury boiling beneath his skin. He stormed past the receptionist, ignoring her protests, and burst into Daniel's office. Daniel looked up, surprised, his face twisting into a smug smile. Jason, I was wondering when you'd show up. Jason's fists clenched. You ruined my life. You took everything from me. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. I didn't take anything. She gave it to me. Willingly. Jason's vision blurred with rage. He lunged, slamming Daniel against the wall, his hands tightening around his collar. You manipulated her. You used her. Daniel's smile never wavered. She came to me. Every single time. She chose me. Jason's grip tightened, his voice trembling. Why? Why did you do this? Daniel's eyes darkened, his voice cold. Because you had everything handed to you. The job, the perfect wife, the perfect life. You didn't earn it. You didn't deserve it. Jason's heart pounded, fury mixing with confusion. This was about revenge? About jealousy? Daniel's lip curled. It was about showing you that nothing in your life was real, not even her. Jason's hands shook. He wanted to hurt him, to make him pay. But what would that solve? It wouldn't change the past. It wouldn't undo the damage. He released Daniel, his body trembling with rage and heartbreak. You're pathetic. You destroyed her just to get to me. Daniel straightened his collar, his smile fading. She knew what she was doing. Don't make excuses for her. Jason turned away, his chest tight. I hope it was worth it, because you're going to lose everything. I'll make sure of it. He walked out, his heart shattered, his world crumbling. But one thing was clear. He was done being a victim. That night, he confronted Emma again. She was waiting for him, her eyes swollen from crying, her face pale and drawn. Jason, please. I need you to understand. I was scared. I made mistakes. But I never stopped loving you. He looked at her, his heart aching. You lied to me, over and over again. How can I ever trust you again? Tears streamed down her face. I was stupid. I was weak. But I never meant to hurt you. I never meant for any of this to happen. He shook his head, his voice hollow. You didn't just hurt me. You destroyed us. You destroyed everything we built together. She sobbed, her shoulders shaking. I'll do anything to fix this, to earn back your trust. His chest tightened, pain radiating through him. You can't. It's too late. She crumpled to the floor, her hands covering her face. Please, don't leave me. Don't leave Noah. We need you. His heart broke all over again. He loved her. God, he loved her so much. But the betrayal was too deep, the wounds too raw. I can't do this anymore, he whispered, his voice cracking. I need time. I need space. He walked out, her sobs echoing behind him, his heart shattering with every step. Days turned into weeks. He moved in with Michael, trying to pick up the pieces of his life, trying to figure out who he was without her. He filed for divorce, the papers heavy in his hands. Emma fought for him, begging for forgiveness, pleading for another chance. But he was too broken, too hurt. He couldn't go back. In the end, they settled on joint custody. Months passed, and the pain dulled to an ache that Jason learned to live with. Life moved forward, whether he was ready or not. He focused on Noah, pouring his love and energy into being the best father he could be. Every other weekend, Noah stayed with him, filling his apartment with laughter and light. Those were the good days, the days when he could almost forget the betrayal, the lies, the heartbreak. But the nights were the hardest. When the apartment was quiet, and the memories crept in like ghosts, the way Emma used to smile at him, her eyes crinkling at the corners, the way she'd rest her head on his shoulder, whispering promises of forever. He'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering when it all went wrong, when she stopped loving him, or if she ever truly did. He threw himself into work, taking on new projects, staying late at the office, anything to keep his mind occupied. He avoided places that reminded him of her, skipped mutual friends' gatherings, dodged questions about the divorce. People whispered, of course. They always did. But he didn't care. He had nothing left to lose. Then, one evening, as he was leaving work, his phone buzzed. A text from Emma. Can we talk? Please. It's important. His stomach twisted. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen. He should ignore it. He should protect his heart. But curiosity won. Okay? Where? They met at a small cafe on the edge of town. Neutral ground. He walked in and found her sitting by the window, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. She looked pale, thinner than he remembered, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She looked up as he approached, her eyes flickering with hope and fear. "Jason, thank you for coming." He sat down, keeping his distance. "You said it was important." She swallowed, her hands trembling. "I know I have no right to ask anything from you, but I need you to listen, just this once." He folded his arms, his jaw tightening. "I'm listening." She took a deep breath, her eyes glistening. "Daniel's been threatening me." Jason's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" She looked down, her voice shaking. He won't leave me alone. He showed up at the house, said he'd ruin me if I didn't get back with him, that he'd take Noah from me." Jason's blood ran cold. "Are you serious?" She nodded, her eyes pleading. "I didn't know who else to turn to. You're the only one who can help me. Protect Noah." 1,000 emotions surged through him: anger, resentment, confusion, but above all, the instinct to protect his son. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Why would he do that? "Why now?" Her voice broke. "Because he's losing his job. The company's under investigation for fraud, and he blames me. He thinks I told you everything, that you're the reason he's being exposed." Jason's mind raced. He remembered the evidence he'd handed over to HR, the anonymous tip about Daniel's shady deals. He thought it was about revenge, about getting back at the man who had destroyed his marriage. But it seemed the fallout was bigger than he'd anticipated. "He's right," Jason admitted, his voice cold. "I exposed him because he's a liar and a cheat, just like you." Emma flinched, her face crumpling. "I know, I deserve that. But I never thought he'd turn on me. I didn't realize how dangerous he was. Until now." Jason's chest tightened. He hated her for what she'd done. But he couldn't deny the fear in her eyes, the desperation in her voice. And Noah was innocent in all of this. He took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging. "I'll help you for Noah's sake, but this doesn't change anything between us." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Thank you. I never wanted to hurt you, Jason. I never wanted any of this." He looked away, his jaw clenching. "You should have thought of that before you chose him." They sat in silence, the weight of betrayal heavy between them. For a moment, he saw a glimpse of the woman he used to love, the woman who used to be his everything. But that woman was gone, replaced by a stranger who wore her face. He stood up, his resolve hardening. "I'll make sure Daniel doesn't come near you or Noah again. But after that, we're done." She looked up, her eyes shining with gratitude and heartbreak. "I understand." He turned and walked away, his heart aching, his mind racing. Daniel had taken everything from him, his marriage, his trust, his happiness, but he wasn't about to let him take his son. Jason was done being a victim. It was time to fight back, and this time he wouldn't rest until Daniel paid for everything he'd done. The following days felt like an endless battle of wits and willpower. Jason couldn't shake the images of Emma's face, the tears in her eyes, the vulnerability she'd shown him. Part of him wanted to reach out, to comfort her, to try and heal the broken pieces of their past. But another part, the stronger part, the part that had endured the betrayal, was determined to put up walls that no amount of regret could breach. He threw himself into action, hiring a lawyer to deal with the legal side of things, drafting up a restraining order against Daniel, and setting up a series of precautions to keep his family safe. But something gnawed at him in the back of his mind, a thought that refused to leave him alone. What if Daniel wasn't just angry at Emma? What if this went deeper? The answer came sooner than Jason expected. It was late one evening when Jason received an anonymous tip, cryptic at first, but gradually revealing more troubling details. A trusted colleague of Daniel's had been arrested on charges of embezzlement, and whispers were spreading that Daniel was about to be exposed for more than just a fling. The fraud investigation wasn't just about business malpractice. It was personal. And it pointed straight back to Daniel. Jason's pulse quickened as he read the message. Daniel hadn't just been after Emma. He had been using her to protect his own skin, all the while covering up his involvement in a web of illegal deals. It wasn't just revenge, it was desperation. If Daniel was about to lose everything, including his job, he would stop at nothing to keep his secrets buried. The next morning, Jason tracked down his contact at the local police department, a friend he'd known for years. They'd worked on a few minor investigations together, but this was different. This was personal. "I need to know everything you've got on Daniel Mercer," Jason said, voice steady but urgent. "All of it. No more games." His friend, Officer Grant, hesitated before responding. "This isn't a small fish, Jason. You're diving into some deep waters. You sure you want to go down that road?" "I don't care about the risk. I want the truth," Jason replied, his jaw set in determination. Grant sighed, clearly weighing his options. "I'll see what I can dig up. Just tread carefully. Once you're involved in this mess, there's no turning back." Jason didn't need more warning. He was already too deep. By the end of the day, he had gathered enough to confirm his suspicions. Daniel's fraud wasn't just corporate, it was personal. He'd been embezzling from multiple companies, manipulating his way into higher positions and laundering money through shell corporations. Emma hadn't been the only one he'd used. He had involved several people in his schemes, and it seemed like everyone had a price. The most damning piece of evidence, however, was the trail of money that led back to his involvement in a crime syndicate. Jason was stunned. The stakes had risen far beyond the infidelity and heartbreak. That night, Jason confronted Emma once more, this time in the same cafe where they had met before. He needed answers, needed to understand how much she knew, how deep she had been drawn into Daniel's world. Emma looked fragile, but there was something new in her eyes, something that hinted at regret and acceptance. "I didn't know, Jason," she whispered as he slid the files across the table. "I didn't know how bad it was. He kept it from me." Jason's heart twisted with a mix of anger and sorrow. "You were a pawn, Emma, a tool for him to cover his tracks, and I was too blind to see it. How many others did he drag into this?" She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "I never knew, I swear. I was too caught up in the affair to see it for what it was. And by the time I realized, it was too late. I couldn't get out." Jason took a slow breath. His heart burned, but he couldn't look away from the woman who had once been his whole world. "I thought you were the one I could trust, Emma. I thought we built this life together. You made your choices just like I made mine, but don't you dare pretend you weren't part of his game." Her voice cracked. "I know I failed you. I know I can't fix what I broke. But Jason, please, I'm begging you, don't let him destroy us. Don't let him destroy Noah." For a moment, the world seemed to slow around him. He saw the woman he'd married, the woman who had promised him everything, but all of it, everything he had once believed, had been shattered. He didn't know who she was anymore. "You've already destroyed us, Emma, but for Noah's sake, I'll stop him. I'll make sure Daniel pays for everything he's done." His words were cold, final. There was no turning back now. The showdown came sooner than Jason expected. With the help of the police, he tracked down Daniel's hidden assets and led the investigation to the heart of the criminal operation. He wasn't doing it for Emma, but for Noah. The days that followed were marked by a strange, unexpected calm. The storm had passed, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing in the aftermath of something far bigger than he had anticipated. His life, once filled with uncertainty, now felt like a delicate balance, the kind of quiet that follows a thunderstorm when the air is thick with the remnants of what was. Emma had been taken by the authorities for questioning, and as the weight of everything settled in, Jason found himself once again facing the truth. The woman he had loved, the woman who carried his child, had been living in the shadows of deception for far too long. There was no clear path forward, but he knew he couldn't keep looking back. The silence between them was deafening when Jason finally visited her in the police holding cell. She looked smaller than he remembered, as if all the lies and weight of her choices had drained the life out of her. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and yet when she saw him standing there, a flicker of something, regret, maybe, crossed her face. "I didn't want this, Jason," she whispered, her voice raw. Jason didn't know how to respond. The words that had once been easy between them now felt foreign, like a language he had forgotten how to speak. He wanted to say something, to tell her that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild, but he couldn't find the strength. Instead, he simply nodded, a silent agreement that they both knew there was no going back. "I know," he finally said, his voice low, "but it's too late now." Emma swallowed hard, as if the weight of her own regret had finally crashed down on her. "Please, take care of Noah. He's all I have left." Jason clenched his fists, feeling the rush of emotion that threatened to overtake him. He could have screamed, could have blamed her for every moment of pain, but instead, he simply turned and walked away. There was no more room for forgiveness. Not now. Maybe not ever. Weeks passed in a blur of court dates, legal paperwork, and small, mundane steps toward some semblance of normalcy. Daniel was locked away in a high-security facility, his empire of lies and crime dismantled, and his reputation in ruins. Emma's future remained uncertain, pending the investigation into her role in Daniel's schemes. She would face the consequences of her actions, but for Jason, that wasn't enough. Her betrayal was deeper than any crime she could commit. Still, life moved forward. Noah, in his innocence, was the only anchor in Jason's world. The boy who had been caught in the storm, unaware of the betrayal that had nearly destroyed his family, became Jason's reason to keep going. One evening, as Jason sat on the porch watching Noah play in the yard, he found himself lost in thought. He had wondered for so long what the right thing to do was. Was it to fight for Emma's redemption, to allow her to somehow return to their lives? Or was it to move on, to build a future for Noah, to let the past be the past? The answer wasn't easy, but it was clear. There were no easy fixes, no magic moments where everything could be swept away. Life wasn't fair, and people weren't always kind. But Jason had learned that the world didn't owe him redemption. It was something he had to carve out for himself, and in this new chapter, with his son at his side, that was enough. Months later, Jason found himself sitting at a small table in a quiet cafe, the air filled with the scent of fresh coffee and pastries. It wasn't a place he frequented often, but that day, he found himself waiting for someone. The tension in the air was almost palpable, but it wasn't the kind of tension he had grown accustomed to over the past year. This was something new, something hopeful. Sophia walked through the door, her smile as warm as ever. She had been a steady presence through all the chaos, someone who had quietly stood by him, offering a shoulder to lean on when he needed it most. They had formed a bond that neither of them expected, a friendship that had evolved into something more. Sophia sat down across from him, her eyes meeting his with an understanding that ran deeper than words could convey. She had seen him at his lowest, and now she was seeing him begin to rise again. "You look better," she said, her voice soft but knowing. "How's Noah?" Jason smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in months. "He's good. He's adjusting. And so am I." Sophia reached for his hand, a simple gesture that meant more than anything she could have said. You've been through hell, Jason, but I'm proud of you. You didn't let it break you. Jason looked down at their hands, feeling the weight of everything that had led him to this moment. It wasn't easy, and I'm not sure I'll ever be fully healed, but I'm trying. Sophia nodded, her smile a quiet reassurance. That's all anyone can do. You've come a long way. The conversation drifted to other things, Noah's latest antics, her work. The days that followed were quieter, but there was a calmness in the air Jason hadn't felt in a long time. Life with Noah, while still challenging at times, was beginning to feel more like a routine, a new normal that Jason could grow into. The weight of his past decisions didn't disappear overnight, but with each passing day, it seemed more manageable. He found himself smiling again, at Noah's jokes, at the little victories they shared together, and at the promise of something new on the horizon. Sophia continued to be a steady, unshakable presence in his life. Their relationship deepened, though neither rushed to define it. It wasn't about labels, but rather the quiet, unspoken understanding that passed between them. Jason knew that Sophia had been his rock through the storm, and though they both were careful with their hearts, there was a sense of belonging when they were together. Then one afternoon, just as the weather was beginning to shift into the warmth of spring, Jason received an unexpected call. It was from his lawyer. "Jason." The voice on the other end was steady but with an undercurrent of urgency. "I need you to come in as soon as possible. We've got new developments." Jason's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure if it was the lingering echoes of the past or the undeniable tension in his chest. But something in the lawyer's voice told him that the calm he'd been feeling had been too good to last. When he arrived at the office, the weight of the moment hit him before he even walked through the door. Inside, his lawyer, Mark, was sitting at the desk with a stack of papers in front of him, his face serious. "Sit down, Jason," Mark said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "We need to talk." Jason sat down, anxiety prickling in his chest. "What's going on?" Mark didn't waste time. "There's been a development regarding Emma. We've just received new evidence that might change everything." Jason's mind raced. What new evidence? What could possibly alter the course of the events that had already unfolded? "It turns out," Mark continued, "Emma wasn't as complicit in everything as we thought. There's a witness who came forward with information about Daniel's manipulation, specifically about Emma's involvement." Jason's pulse quickened. The shock of hearing that Emma might not have been entirely to blame rattled him. Had he misjudged her? Had he been so consumed by his own pain that he hadn't seen the full picture? "We're still piecing things together," Mark said, handing him a few papers. "But it's clear Emma wasn't the mastermind here. She was manipulated just like you were." Jason stared at the papers. The pieces of the puzzle he thought he'd already completed now shattered before him. The feeling of betrayal he'd been carrying for months shifted to confusion and something like guilt. Had he been wrong? Had Emma really been a victim in all of this? "I need to ask you something, Jason." Mark's voice broke through his thoughts. "Do you want to press charges against Emma for her involvement in this? Or do you think there's another path forward?" Jason was silent, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had spent so much time hating Emma for what she'd done, for what he thought was deliberate betrayal. But now he didn't know what to think. "Give me some time," Jason finally said, his voice tight. "I need to process this. I need to understand it." The following days were a blur of reflection. Jason spent long hours thinking about Emma, about the life they had shared, about the truth that was slowly emerging. Sophia was there for him, but Jason didn't know how to explain the internal struggle he was facing. Was he supposed to forgive her? Or was forgiveness too simple for the damage she had caused? He didn't have the answers, but as he stood at the edge of the decision, he realized something. He wasn't the same person anymore. He was different now, stronger, more capable of facing the complexities of life and the people who crossed. his path. A week later, he sat down in front of the lawyer again. "I've thought about it," Jason said, his voice steady. "And I don't want to press charges against Emma." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure?" Jason nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I think there's more to her story than I realized. I don't think she's the enemy here." Mark seemed to respect his decision, but still wanted to make sure Jason understood the full gravity of his choice. "It's your call, Jason. But this may open the door for reconciliation. It won't be easy." Jason exhaled slowly. Reconciliation wasn't something he was ready for yet, but at least now he could move forward knowing he had made the choice. With clarity. The road to healing was his to decide, and he didn't need to rush it. In the months that followed, Jason continued to rebuild his life. He focused on being the best father he could be to Noah, on being present and active in his son's life. Sophia remained by his side. As the months slipped by, the weight of the past began to feel more like a distant memory, though it still lingered in the back of Jason's mind, like the shadow of a storm that had long since passed but left its mark. Noah continued to thrive, his laughter echoing through their home, his innocent joy a reminder of why Jason fought so hard to rebuild, to move forward. And Sophia remained his anchor, the one person who truly understood the depth of his pain and the complexity of the decisions that followed. But even as the days grew quieter, the question of Emma and what she had done still hung in the air like a fog Jason couldn't entirely shake. He had chosen not to press charges, but the question of what to do with her continued to sit heavily in his heart. There was no clear answer, only a gnawing sense that forgiveness, if it ever came, would take time, if it came at all. It was a warm evening when Jason found himself staring out over the city skyline, his thoughts drifting. Noah was in bed, and the house had fallen into that comfortable silence Jason had grown accustomed to. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, the vibration cutting through the stillness of the room. He picked it up, seeing an unfamiliar number flash across the screen. A brief hesitation. Then he answered. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was calm, measured. "Jason?" "It's Emma." His stomach tightened at the sound of her voice. After everything that had happened, he hadn't expected to hear from her. Again, at least not so soon. There was no bitterness in her tone, but a quiet sincerity that caught him off guard. "Emma," he replied, his voice cautious. "What is it?" "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice shaky. I've been through a lot, Jason, and I've had a lot of time to think, but I need you to understand something." Jason's grip on the phone tightened. "I'm listening." There was a pause, as if Emma was gathering her thoughts. When she spoke again, it was softer, as if she was bracing herself for something. "Daniel didn't just manipulate me," she began. "He used everything I had. He took my weaknesses and twisted them, and I let him. But I need you to know that. I never meant to hurt you, Jason. I never wanted to destroy everything we had." Jason felt the weight of her words settle heavily on his chest. The anger he thought he had buried came flooding back, but it was tempered by something else. An echo of empathy, of the realization that perhaps she was, in some way, just as much a victim as he had been. "I don't know what to say, Emma," Jason muttered, his voice tight with emotion. "You can't just undo all of this with a few words." "I'm not asking you to forgive me," she said, her voice trembling now. "I just need you to know that I'm sorry, and that I'm trying to make things right. I've been going to therapy, trying to understand why I did what I did. It's not an excuse. It's just the truth." Jason stood there, the weight of her confession sinking in. His mind raced. Could he really understand the depth of her regret? Could he ever trust her again, even with the truth now laid bare? Before him? "I don't know if I can ever trust you again," he finally said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. "But I hear you, Emma. I hear what you're saying." There was a long silence on the other end, the quiet stretching between them. Then, Finally, Emma spoke again. "I don't expect you to fix everything for me," she said, her voice small. "But I hope one day you'll find it in your heart to forgive me. Not for me, Jason, but for you, so you can move on. And maybe, just maybe, we can find some peace." Jason stood there, the phone pressed to his ear, his heart conflicted, unsure of what to feel. He wanted closure. He wanted everything to make sense again. But the truth was, he was still in the middle of it all, still wrestling with the ghosts of the past. "I'll think about it," he said quietly, not knowing if that was the answer she wanted, but knowing it was all he could give her. After a long moment, Emma sighed softly. "Thank you, Jason. That's all I can ask for." As Jason hung up the phone, he leaned against the counter, his thoughts swirling. Was forgiveness something he could truly give, or had too much been broken for it to ever heal? Sophia entered the kitchen just then, her footsteps soft on the hardwood floor. She looked at him, sensing the shift in his mood. "You okay?" she asked, her voice gentle as she placed a hand on his shoulder. Jason didn't answer immediately. Instead, he just nodded, feeling the weight of it all settling into his bones. He didn't know what the future held, or what would come of Emma's apology. But for the first time in a long time, he felt the stirring of something new, hope, maybe, or the possibility of a future where forgiveness, if it came, could start with himself. "I'm okay," Jason finally said, his voice steady. "I'm just figuring things out." Sophia smiled, her eyes soft with understanding. The following weeks seemed to settle into a rhythm, though Jason could feel the undercurrent of tension still flowing beneath the surface. It wasn't that he had forgotten what Emma had done or the pain that had followed, but there was a part of him, deep within, that felt a pull toward understanding. Whether it was the promise of peace or simply the realization that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, he wasn't sure. But he knew something had shifted, and the weight of the past wasn't as heavy as it had been before. Sophia noticed the change in him. He was quieter, more reflective, but there was a calmness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. She didn't press him for answers, knowing that Jason would share when he was ready, and so they continued their life side by side, with a quiet understanding that their bond was growing stronger, even if it wasn't always spoken aloud. One evening, as they sat on the porch with the sound of crickets in the air, Sophia turned to Jason with a thoughtful look in her eyes. "You've been a little distant lately," she said, her voice soft but direct. "I don't want to push you, but I can see you're still wrestling with something. If you need to talk about it, I'm here." Jason looked at her, her words grounding him, and for a moment, he let himself lean into the vulnerability he had avoided for so long. He didn't want to keep secrets, but he also didn't want to burden her with the weight of everything that had happened. And yet Sophia had always been there, even when the storm had been at its worst. "I heard from Emma," he said quietly, almost as if testing the waters. He paused, unsure of how she would react, but Sophia simply nodded, waiting for him to continue. "She called, and I think she's trying to make amends, trying to heal from what happened. I don't know what to make of it." Sophia's gaze softened, and she reached out, placing her hand gently on his. "That's a lot to process," she said, her voice full of understanding. "But Jason, I need you to know something." He looked at her, his heart in his throat, but her next words weren't what he expected. "I'm not asking you to forget what happened with Emma, or to change your feelings about it," she said, her eyes locking with his. "But I want you to know that I'm here no matter what you choose. I don't want you to carry that burden alone." Jason felt something shift within him, an overwhelming sense of gratitude for Sophia's unwavering support. He hadn't realized how much he had been holding back, not just from her, but from himself. The struggle with forgiveness, with finding peace, had felt so isolating, but here, With Sophia by his side, it felt different. He wasn't alone. "I don't know what the future holds," Jason said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I want to be here. I want to move forward, but I don't want to keep letting the past define me." Sophia squeezed his hand, her eyes searching his face. "You're not the man you were back then," she said. "You've come so far. Whatever happens with Emma, whatever happens in the future, you don't have to carry that pain forever." Jason took a deep breath, his heart heavy but lighter at the same time. Maybe forgiveness wasn't just about Emma. Maybe it was about forgiving himself, too. The past was a part of him, but it didn't have to control him anymore. He could take the lessons from it, grow from them, and move forward. The next day, Jason made a decision. He called Emma. It took a few rings before she picked up, and when she did, there was a pause, a hesitation, as if she, too, wasn't sure what to say. But Jason didn't wait for the words to form. He spoke first, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "Emma, I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he began, "about how you've been trying to make things right. And I want you to know that I'm not holding on to the anger anymore. I don't know if I'll ever truly forgive you, but I can't let this ruin me anymore." He could hear Emma's breath catch on the other end of the line, and for a moment there was silence. But then, her voice broke through, quiet, but sincere. "I don't expect your forgiveness, Jason. I know I've hurt you beyond measure. I've hurt myself too. But I needed you to know the truth, that I'm trying to be better. I'm trying to fix the pieces I broke." Jason closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words. It wasn't an easy thing to hear, but it was the truth, her truth. And in that moment, he realized that perhaps that was enough, not for reconciliation, not for a future together, but for healing, not just for her, but for him too. "I don't know what happens next," Jason said, his voice firm. "But I won't keep running from this. We both have our own journeys to follow." "I understand," Emma replied quietly. "And thank you, Jason, for not holding on to the anger. That means more to me than you'll ever know." As they ended the call, Jason felt something inside of him shift once more. As the weeks unfolded, the sense of clarity that had settled in Jason's heart only deepened. There were moments of doubt, of course, those fleeting thoughts that would creep in, reminding him of the pain, the betrayal, the shattered trust. But the more he allowed himself to embrace the present, the less those shadows seemed to loom over him. It wasn't an instant transformation, but each day felt like a small victory, a step forward. Sophia noticed it too. Jason wasn't as distant as before, though there were still moments when his thoughts seemed far away. But that was part of him, his mind always active, always analyzing, always questioning. She didn't mind. She understood him, perhaps better than anyone ever had. One evening, they sat together in the quiet of their living room, the soft hum of the city outside their windows. Jason had been reflecting on what he'd learned, on how far he had come. "I'm proud of you," Sophia said, her voice low but filled with sincerity, "for facing everything head-on, for not letting it break you." Jason turned to her, his expression softening as he met her gaze. "I couldn't have done it without you," he replied, his voice tinged with gratitude. "You've been a constant, even when I didn't deserve it. I don't think I could have gotten through any of this if it weren't for you." Sophia smiled, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "We're in this together," she said, her words carrying more weight than just reassurance. "Whatever happens, we face it side by side." There was an unspoken promise between them in that moment, an understanding that the future, no matter what it held, would be navigated together. For Jason, it was a comfort to know that he wasn't alone in this world, that there were still people who would stand by him, no matter how difficult the journey. But even in the midst of that peace, There was still a lingering sense of something, unresolved, something that wouldn't let him move forward entirely without closure. And so, after much internal debate, Jason reached out once again, this time to her co-worker, Ben. The man who had been part of the tangled web, the one who had unknowingly played a role in Emma's betrayal. Jason didn't know what to expect. Was Ben aware of the emotional wreckage his actions had caused? Did he feel any guilt? Any remorse? The conversation could go in any direction, but Jason felt that he needed to hear it, to know where Ben stood, if only to put his mind at ease. The phone call was brief, but it was enough. "Jason," Ben said, his voice steady, but there was something tight in his tone. "I never meant for any of this to happen. Emma and well, it was a mistake. I'm sorry for what it's done to you. I don't know how to fix it, but I regret everything." Jason listened, processing each word. There was no grand revelation, no new bombshells to uncover, just an admission of guilt. And perhaps that was enough. It wasn't about reconciliation or understanding anymore. It was simply about acknowledging the past for what it was. "I appreciate your honesty," Jason said after a long pause. "But I need to move on from this. For both of us." There was a long silence on the other end before Ben spoke again, his voice softer now. "I get it, man. I really do. And if there's anything I can do to make amends, to give you peace of mind, just let me know." Jason didn't know what could fix the damage that had been done, but hearing Ben's words gave him something important, a sense of finality. It wasn't about vengeance anymore, nor was it about forgiveness in the traditional sense. It was about moving forward, finally putting this chapter behind him. As the conversation ended, Jason felt a strange weight lift from his chest. He hadn't expected it, but he was grateful for it nonetheless. The next few weeks passed in a blur, filled with quiet moments and new beginnings. Emma remained a part of his past, but she was fading into the distance, no longer the center of his thoughts. The peace that Sophia had promised was settling over him in waves, each one pushing the lingering anger and resentment further away. Then, one evening, as they walked through the park near their apartment, Jason felt a sense of calm settle over him, unlike anything he had experienced before. The weight of the past seemed gone, as if it had finally been shed. And in its place, there was something new, something he couldn't quite put into words. Sophia, walking beside him, glanced over and smiled. "You seem different," she said, her voice light but full of curiosity. Jason stopped for a moment, looking at her with a soft expression. "I am," he said simply. "I think for the first time in a long time I'm actually free." Her smile widened and she took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Then let's see where that freedom takes us." And as they continued their walk side by side, Jason couldn't help but feel that while the past would always be a part of him, it no longer defined him. As the days passed, Jason and Sophia continued their quiet journey toward rebuilding their lives together. There were still moments of uncertainty, those fleeting glimpses of the past that crept up unexpectedly, but they no longer held the same power over him. The weight that had once seemed insurmountable had lifted, replaced by a new sense of purpose, of clarity. The healing wasn't linear, but it was happening. Sophia noticed a change in him, too. He had become more open, more present. He was there, in the small moments, in the shared laughter over dinner, in the quiet conversations before bed. It was as if the man she had fallen in love with was slowly returning, albeit with new layers of wisdom and resilience. One evening, as they sat on the couch together, watching the muted glow of the television, Sophia reached for his hand. "You've come so far," she said softly, her fingers tracing the lines of his palm. "And I've seen you struggle, but I want you to know how proud I am of you." Jason squeezed her hand gently, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you," he admitted, his voice sincere. "You've been my anchor through it all. I don't think I could have faced any of it without your support." She smiled at him, her eyes shining with affection. "And you never will have to face it alone." There was a quiet moment between them, a shared understanding that words couldn't fully capture. They didn't need to say anything more. They knew that they had built something strong, something worth fighting for. But despite the peace they had found, life had a way of throwing curveballs when least expected. The phone rang one afternoon, and when Jason saw the name on the screen, his heart skipped a beat. It was Emma. He stared at the phone for a moment, unsure whether to answer. Sophia, noticing his hesitation, gave him a reassuring look. "Do what you need to do," she said, her voice calm but supportive. With a deep breath, Jason swiped the screen and answered. "Hello?" he said, his voice steady despite the rush of emotions that surged within him. "Jason," Emma's voice was soft, almost hesitant. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I wanted to reach out." Jason's grip tightened on the phone. "What is it, Emma?" There was a long pause on the other end before she spoke again, her tone uncertain. I need to apologize again for everything. And I want you to know that I've been working on myself, trying to be a better person. It's been hard, but I'm trying." Jason listened, his heart conflicted. He could hear the sincerity in her voice, but it didn't erase the hurt that had been caused. It didn't erase the betrayal. "I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive you, Emma," Jason said, his voice steady but tinged with pain. "But I'm not holding on to the anger anymore. I've let go of it. I need to move on." There was silence on the other end, and Jason could almost hear the weight of her words as she processed his response. "I understand," she finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "I just wanted to say that I'm truly sorry. And if there's anything I can ever do to make things right, I'm here." Jason took a deep breath, the tension in his chest slowly releasing. "I appreciate your apology," he said quietly, "but I think we've both done enough. It's time to move on." And with that, the conversation ended. Jason set the phone down, with a sense of finality, as if he had closed a chapter that had been open for far too long. Sophia, who had been waiting patiently, looked at him with a gentle smile. "How do you feel?" Jason let out a long breath. "Relieved," he said, his voice steady. "I don't know if I can ever forgive her completely, but I've let go of the anger. I'm free of it." Sophia nodded, her eyes full of understanding. "You've come so far, Jason, and no matter what comes next, we'll face it together." It was a simple truth, but it was one that held immense power. No matter what challenges the future held, no matter what twists life might throw their way, Jason knew that he wasn't alone, and in that certainty, he found peace. The weeks that followed were marked by an almost unspoken bond between Jason and Sophia, a bond that had grown deeper, stronger, and more resilient with time. They built new memories, each one an affirmation of the life they were creating together. Jason also continued to reflect on his journey, the mistakes he had made, the lessons he had learned, and the strength he had found within himself. There was still healing to be done, but he no longer feared the process. It was no longer something to avoid or resist. It was something he had come to embrace. One evening, as they stood on the balcony of their apartment, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of pink and orange, Jason wrapped his arm around Sophia, pulling her close. "I'm glad we're here," he said quietly, his voice full of contentment. Sophia leaned her head against his shoulder, a soft smile on her lips. "Me too." As the seasons began to change, so did the rhythm of Jason's life. With each passing day, the shadows of the past seemed to recede, replaced by a lightness he hadn't known in years. Sophia, ever patient, continued to walk beside him, offering quiet encouragement and love. Their bond had deepened, no longer just a refuge from the storm, but a source of strength and healing. It was as though they had both shed old skins, Jason from the weight of his past betrayals, and Sophia from the lingering traces of her own doubts. Together they were no longer just surviving, they were thriving. But despite the progress, there was a part of Jason that could not escape the need for answers. Not in a vengeful way, but in a quiet, almost contemplative sense. Emma's actions, the lies, the choices that had led to this fracture in his life still held mysteries he had yet to fully untangle. It wasn't about reconciliation or closure anymore. It was more about understanding the layers of truth, what had really happened, and why. He had learned a great deal, but there were still parts of the puzzle left unsolved. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Sophia with her feet curled beneath her, Jason with his mind drifting, he finally spoke the thought that had been occupying his mind for days. "I've been thinking a lot about Emma," Jason began, his voice casual, but there was a certain weight to it. "About everything. Not in a way that makes me angry, just in a way that feels like there's something still unfinished." Sophia looked over at him, her expression soft. "What do you mean?" Jason leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I don't know. I've accepted what happened. I've moved past it in a way. But there's this nagging feeling that I don't know the full story. I don't understand why she did what she did." Sophia nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. "You don't have to have all the answers, Jason. You've let go of the anger. That's the most important thing." "I know," he said, rubbing his hand over his face. "But I think understanding why it happened, how she got there, might help me stop wondering about it. I don't want to be stuck in the past. I just want to know why." Sophia was silent for a long moment, her brow furrowing as she considered his words. Finally, she spoke, her voice gentle. "If you want to seek out those answers, I'll support you. But I don't want you to lose sight of how far you've come. You don't need Emma's approval or her explanations to move forward." Jason appreciated her understanding, but a part of him couldn't let go of the need to understand the motivations behind Emma's choices. So he made a decision. The next morning, Jason reached out to someone he hadn't spoken to in months, Emma's sister, Laura. They had been friends once, long before everything had fallen apart, and although their relationship had been strained since the affair, he felt that Laura might be the key to unlocking the pieces of the puzzle he had been carrying around for so long. Laura, despite everything that had happened, had always been kind to him. She had been a silent observer in the whole mess, and perhaps, just perhaps, she could offer him some insight into Emma's mindset. He sent a simple message. "I know it's been a while, but if you're willing to talk, I'd like to understand a few things." The response came within hours. "I don't know if I have all the answers, Jason, but I'm willing to talk. Let's meet." They agreed to meet at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that had been neutral ground for both of them in the past. When Jason walked in, he spotted Laura sitting at a corner booth, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, looking like someone who had carried a heavy weight for too long. She glanced up as he approached, offering him a tentative smile. "Jason," she said softly, her voice laced with an unfamiliar sadness. "It's been a while." He sat down across from her, his posture open but cautious. "It has," he agreed. "And I've been thinking a lot about everything. About Emma. I know I can't change what happened, but I need to understand it. If you're willing, I just want to know why. What led her down that path?" Laura took a deep breath, her eyes momentarily closing as if she were gathering her thoughts. When she opened them again, there was a vulnerability in her gaze that Jason hadn't expected. "Jason, I wish I could give you a simple answer. I wish I could tell you it was just one thing, one choice, one mistake that caused it all. But It wasn't like that. There were so many layers to it, and Emma, she was lost for a long time before any of this happened. Jason felt a tightening in his chest. What do you mean? What was she struggling with? Laura hesitated for a moment, then let out a long sigh. She didn't feel seen. Not by you, not by anyone. She was overwhelmed, Jason. With the pregnancy, with work, with everything. And when Ben came along, he made her feel seen. Months passed, and the shadows of Jason's past continued to fade, not completely erased, but integrated into the story of who he had become. The uncertainty that had once gripped him, the need for answers, for validation, had been replaced by something more profound, a quiet sense of self-possession. He had learned to accept that not everything in life could be neatly explained, and that some wounds, though they would never fully heal, could be carried without their weight defining him. Sophia, as always, remained a steady presence. Her support had never wavered, but now there was something new in their relationship, a deep sense of trust, not just in each other, but in the future they were building together. Their evenings were filled with the small moments that made up a life, shared laughter, quiet conversations, the comfort of knowing they could weather anything together. Jason had found his rhythm again, both in his work and in his personal life. His career, which had stalled in the wake of the chaos, was slowly picking up. He had put more focus into rebuilding his professional relationships, leveraging the lessons learned from the betrayal to redefine what success meant to him. It wasn't about the hustle anymore. It was about creating something meaningful, something he could be proud of. Yet despite this newfound peace, the world had a way of reminding him that life was rarely predictable. It was an afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over his desk as he reviewed the latest project proposal, when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, an unknown number. His heart skipped, an old, familiar tension creeping up his spine. It had been so long since he'd heard from anyone connected to Emma, and yet something in him knew that this call was connected to her. With a steady hand, he picked up the phone. Hello? His voice was calm, even though his mind was racing. There was a long pause before the voice on the other end spoke. Jason, it's Laura. His breath caught in his throat. Laura, is everything okay? There was an unusual edge to her voice. No, it's not. I need to tell you something. Jason sat back in his chair, his mind whirling. What's going on? Is Emma okay? No, Laura replied, her voice tight. It's not Emma, it's Ben. Jason felt his stomach tighten. Ben? I found out something recently. Something about him. He's been involved in something shady, illegal. I don't know how deep it goes, but I think he might have been using Emma to cover his tracks. And now he's gone. Disappeared. I don't think this is something you want to ignore. Jason's mind spun, images of the past few months flashing before his eyes, the mystery of Emma's affair with Ben, the way everything had seemed to suddenly spiral. It had always seemed like just an affair, just a betrayal. But now, it was starting to look like something far more dangerous. Are you sure about this? Jason asked, his voice steady, but his thoughts running wild. Are you telling me Ben was, what, involved in criminal activity, and Emma? What does she have to do with this? I don't have all the details, Laura admitted, but I know enough. Ben's gone, and I have a feeling Emma might be in over her head. I didn't want to get involved, but I think you need to know. I don't know if it's safe for her, for you, for anyone. Jason leaned forward, his mind racing. It was too much to process. Too many questions piling up without answers. The betrayal, the affair, the lies, and now the involvement in something far darker. I'll find out what's going on, Jason said, his voice firm, the weight of the decision settling on him. I'll take care of it, Thank you, Laura, for telling me. As the call ended, Jason sat there for a moment, the reality of the situation sinking in. He had thought he'd moved past Emma, thought he had shed the last remnants of the past. But now it seemed that the past wasn't finished with him. There were still shadows to chase, still pieces of the puzzle that needed to be put together. And if Emma was in danger, or if her involvement in something criminal was going to affect him, then he couldn't walk away now. The future, Jason realized, wasn't about avoiding the past. It was about facing it head-on, unearthing the truth and dealing with whatever came next. With a deep breath, he dialed Sophia's number, his mind already formulating the next steps. There was no turning back now. Whatever came next, Jason knew he wouldn't be facing it alone. Jason's phone buzzed again, breaking the silence that had settled in his office. It was Sophia. He had already planned to tell her everything, but now, hearing her voice, it felt as though the weight of everything was bearing down on him in a new, more urgent way. "Hey, babe," he said, trying to keep his tone calm. "I've got something I need to talk to you about." Sophia's voice was warm, but there was a hint of concern that seeped through. "What's going on? You sound different." Jason paused, glancing at the window, the waning light of the afternoon falling over him in uneven stretches. "There's something I need to tell you. Something about Emma and Ben. It's not just about an affair anymore. There's something more complicated going on." He could hear the intake of her breath on the other end, a slight hitch in her voice. "Jason, you're scaring me." "What do you mean?" Jason leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hand over his face. "I just talked to Laura. Ben's gone, disappeared. But before he left, he was involved in something illegal, something that might have involved Emma. Laura doesn't know all the details, but it's bad. And now I don't know what it means for us, for her. I need to figure out what's happening." Sophia was silent for a long moment, and Jason could almost hear the wheels turning in her head. She had always been the steady one between them, the calm in the storm. "What do you want to do about it?" she asked quietly, but with a firmness in her voice that grounded him. "I don't know," Jason admitted. "I need to get to the bottom of this. Find out what Emma's really involved in and why she kept this from me. This whole thing was bad enough, but now it's bigger than just an affair. It's dangerous." "I understand," Sophia said, her voice soft but supportive. "But whatever happens, Jason, we'll face it together. You're not alone in this." That was all he needed to hear. Her words, simple yet profound, gave him the clarity to take the next step. This wasn't just about him or about Emma anymore. This was bigger, more dangerous than he had anticipated. And if there was anything Jason had learned from all the heartbreak and confusion, it was that he didn't have to go through it alone. "I'll figure this out," Jason said, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "I'm going to track down Ben's last known whereabouts. I need to understand how deep this goes, and if Emma's still in danger." Sophia's voice held a trace of worry, but it was tempered with determination. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I will," Jason replied. "I promise." After the call ended, Jason sat for a moment, considering his options. The investigation into Ben's disappearance wasn't going to be easy, but he was no stranger to chasing down the truth. He had to find out what was going on and why Emma had kept this hidden from him for so long. But as much as he wanted answers, Jason knew there were still risks involved. If Ben had been involved in something criminal, it wasn't just Emma who could be in danger. It could be anyone connected to her. And Jason, whether he liked it or not, was now tied up in all of it. Jason's first move was to contact a private investigator, someone he could trust to look into Ben's activities without alerting the wrong people. He explained everything to the investigator, laying out the situation as clearly as he could. The PI, a woman named Margot who had worked with him on a few smaller cases, agreed to take on the job. "Don't worry, Jason," Margot said when they spoke on the phone. "We'll dig into this. I'll find out where Ben's been, who he's been involved with, and what kind of trouble he's in. But you need to be prepared for anything." "I am," Jason replied, his voice resolute. "Just keep me updated. I don't care how messy this gets. I need to know the truth." After hanging up with Margot, Jason decided to pay one last visit to the place where everything had started, the cafe where he had met with Laura. Something about it felt like the last place he could find any remaining clues. He hadn't been back since that day, and now it felt like a place where he could think clearly, away from the distractions of the office and his apartment. As he sat in the same corner booth, sipping a coffee that had long since gone, cold, Jason's mind raced. He thought about the night Emma had left, about the lies, the secrets she had kept. Was it all part of some bigger plan, or had she really been caught up in something she couldn't control? The door to the cafe jingled, and Jason's heart skipped a beat as he saw a familiar face step inside. It was Laura. Without hesitation, she walked straight over to his table, her face pale, eyes wide with urgency. "Jason, you need to know something else. I didn't tell you everything before. I should have. Ben, he didn't just disappear. I heard from a friend of mine, he's in hiding. He's afraid for his life, and he's not hiding because of the illegal stuff he was involved in." The city stretched out before Jason, its skyline an unfeeling backdrop to the turbulence swirling inside him. Every step felt heavier now, like he was being drawn into a web of danger and secrets he hadn't anticipated. The truth he was chasing no longer felt like just a way to understand the past. It was a means of survival. He couldn't ignore it now. His phone buzzed again as he walked through the crowded streets. He glanced down, expecting another message from Margot, but instead it was from Sophia. "Jason, I'm worried. I've been thinking about everything you said, and I just don't want you to go down this road alone. Please be careful. I love you." For a moment, he hesitated, staring at her words. It wasn't just her love that was giving him strength now. It was the reminder that he wasn't alone in this. But the danger he was facing wasn't something he could share easily, not without risking her safety. He couldn't explain everything. "Not yet," he quickly typed back. "I'm on my way to meet Margot. I'll keep you updated, but please trust me. I'm doing this for us. I love you too." With the message sent, Jason's mind shifted back to the matter at hand. He needed answers. He needed to track down Ben's last known movements, and he had one lead: Ben's old apartment. It had been empty for weeks now, but there were still a few things that didn't sit right. If someone was after Ben, if this danger truly existed, Ben's place might be the last piece of the puzzle. Margot had agreed to meet him there. They had arranged to go over whatever the investigation had turned up. Jason had to trust her, though he knew the deeper they dug, the more dangerous things would get. He arrived at Ben's old apartment building, the place looking as deserted as it had in the weeks since Ben had vanished. The dim streetlights above flickered, casting eerie shadows on the sidewalk. Jason took a steadying breath, adjusting the collar of his jacket against the cold, and made his way to the entrance. Margot was already there, her figure outlined by the glow from the building's entrance. She gave him a quick nod when she saw him, her face stern. All business now. "Jason," she said, her voice low but sharp. "I've been digging through Ben's records. He was in deeper than I thought. He didn't just vanish. He's hiding because someone wants him dead." Jason's heart dropped. "Who's after him?" Margot glanced around, making sure no one was watching them. "I've got a name, and it's not just some random thug. The person behind this is well connected, Jason. This isn't the kind of danger you can outrun." Jason's pulse quickened. "Who is it?" Margot stepped closer, pulling out a piece of paper. "A man named Elias Drake. He's been tied to organized, Crime for years. Ben got tangled up with him, maybe without realizing just how deep. But now that he's crossed a line, well, people like Drake don't just let things go. They make sure their problems disappear. Jason absorbed the information slowly, processing the weight of it. Elias Drake was no stranger to power or violence. If he had a hand in Ben's disappearance, then everything had just escalated. The fact that Emma might still be caught in the middle made Jason's chest tighten with fear. "Where do we find Drake?" Jason asked, his voice steady despite the rising dread. Margot shook her head. "It's not that simple. He's like a ghost. But we've got a few leads. Ben's last few transactions. They point to a place called the Steel Mill Warehouse on the outskirts of town. If Drake's involved, that's where he'll be." Jason nodded grimly. "Then that's where we're headed, the Steel Mill Warehouse." The name alone gave Jason chills. He had heard whispers about it in the past, rumors of shady deals and illegal operations. But now it was no longer a rumor. It was the epicenter of everything that had gone wrong. The drive there was tense, the world outside the car window blurring as Jason's thoughts raced. If Elias Drake was involved, it meant there were far more lives at stake than he had realized. He wasn't just trying to protect Emma, he was trying to stop a criminal empire from swallowing them all whole. When they arrived at the warehouse, it was a ghostly sight. Dark, looming, and silent except for the occasional creak of metal. Jason felt his heartbeat in his throat as they parked the car a few blocks away, careful not to draw attention. Margot glanced over at him. "We're going in together," she said firmly. "We don't know what we're walking into, but I'm not letting you do this alone." Jason gave a tight nod, and they moved toward the entrance, sticking to the shadows. Every step was calculated, each movement measured. They reached the doors, which were slightly ajar. The smell of oil and rust filled the air, and the distant sound of murmured voices echoed from inside. Jason motioned for Margot to wait, then crept closer to the open door. He peered inside, trying to make out what he could see. The tension in the air thickened as Jason watched Ben's eyes flicker to where he stood in the shadows. His breath caught in his chest. Had Ben seen him? Or was it just a fleeting moment of paranoia? Regardless, Jason knew he couldn't stay, hidden for much longer. The stakes had shifted. It wasn't just about finding answers anymore. It was about survival. Margot was at his side, her face pale but determined. She nodded, signaling that they needed to get closer. Jason's instincts kicked in. They needed to hear what was going on in that room. They needed leverage, anything that would give them the upper hand. He crept along the edge of the warehouse, careful to avoid the narrow beams of light that spilled from the overhead lamps. He could hear snippets of conversation now, voices low and muffled but unmistakably tense. Drake's voice cut through the dimness, smooth but cold. "Ben, you've crossed a line. I don't care who you've pissed off, but now you owe me. You understand that, right?" Ben's voice was weak, desperate. I didn't mean to. I swear. I thought I could get out, but they won't let me. They know what I've done, and they'll come for me if I don't." Jason's pulse quickened. The mention of "they" was more than a vague threat. It was a warning, a sign that Ben wasn't just tangled up with Elias Drake. There were other players involved, bigger, more dangerous ones. Drake interrupted. "I don't care who they are, Ben. You owe me. You know what happens when people don't pay their debts." A beat of silence followed, and Jason's eyes flicked to Margot. She was listening intently, eyes scanning the room for any signs of movement. He motioned for her to keep moving. They had to get closer, just a few more feet. Ben's voice broke again, shaky. I've got to get out of here. I can't stay. You don't understand. Emma, she's pregnant. I can't leave her." Jason's stomach twisted at the mention of Emma. If Ben was trying to protect her, that meant she was deeper in this than he'd realized. Drake let out a harsh laugh, the sound echoing off. the concrete walls. "You think I care about your problems, Ben? You think your little family matters to me? You're in too deep now. You're either with me or you're dead." Jason's heart raced. The situation was more dangerous than ever. Drake wasn't just trying to intimidate Ben, he was trying to break him. And if Ben had no way out, then Emma was just as trapped. Jason moved closer to the table, inching behind a stack of crates. He couldn't let Drake know he was here, couldn't risk blowing his cover. He needed to hear more. "Please." Ben's voice was barely audible now, a whisper of desperation. "I'll do whatever you want. Just leave Emma out of this. She doesn't know anything. She doesn't deserve this." Jason clenched his fists, a cold rage burning inside him. Emma, his wife, the woman carrying his child, was at the center of this mess. And Ben was pleading for her safety, but Jason knew the moment they were involved in Drake's world, nothing would ever be safe again. The conversation shifted. Drake leaned in, his voice low, menacing. "I'm not here to negotiate. Ben, I'm here to tell you how this ends. You'll make things right, or you'll never see her again. You'll never see anyone again." A chill ran down Jason's spine as he heard the unmistakable sound of a weapon being drawn, a subtle click that sent waves of dread through him. This was escalating faster than he had expected. They needed to act now. Jason glanced at Margot. She was already moving, stealthily, toward a stack of old pallets that would give them a clear vantage point. They were close. So close. He could feel the pressure of time bearing down on him. He couldn't just wait for Ben to get out. He had to do something. He reached for his phone, quickly typing a message to Margot. "We need to make sure Emma's safe. Don't let him make any moves." Margot gave him a quick glance and nodded, acknowledging the plan. She pulled out a small device from her jacket pocket, something Jason had never seen before, and set it on the ground near their position. It was a tracker, one she'd used for surveillance before. It would send a signal directly to the police, alerting them to their exact location, while giving them a few precious minutes to escape if things went south. Jason's mind raced. He couldn't allow himself to freeze now. Everything depended on these next few minutes. Drake's voice broke through the tension. "You've got one chance to fix this, Ben, and I'll be waiting. You know where to find me." The sound of footsteps followed, fading as Drake and his men began to move away from the table. Ben stayed behind, slumped in defeat. It was clear that he was on the brink of breaking, but Jason could see that there was still a small piece of resistance in him, a flicker of fight that hadn't been fully snuffed out. Jason took a breath. They couldn't wait any longer. Ben's eyes flickered with a mixture of desperation and hope as he glanced from Jason to Margot. His shoulders slumped, defeated, but there was something in his gaze, a silent plea for salvation. Jason knew they couldn't waste any more time. Ben was teetering on the edge, and they had to act fast before Drake and his men returned. "Ben," Jason said firmly, his voice low but resolute, "we don't have time. We need to get you out of here. They'll be back any second." Ben nodded slowly, but his fear was palpable. I don't know if I can do it. I've made too many enemies, Jason. This is bigger than me." Jason stepped forward, his eyes locking with Ben's. "You're not alone in this anymore. We'll protect you. But we need you to trust us. You said Emma doesn't deserve this. Then help us get her out. Help us get you both out of this mess before it's too late." Margot moved into position, her hand resting lightly on her concealed weapon. She wasn't taking any chances. Every sound from the hallway felt like a threat now, every distant footstep amplified by their silence. The seconds felt like hours. "All right," Ben whispered, barely audible. "I'll come with you, but we need to move fast. I know where they're keeping Emma, but we have to get past Drake's guys first. They're heavily armed." Jason could feel his heartbeat quicken, but he nodded. He had no choice now. This wasn't just about unraveling the truth. It was about saving Emma, saving Ben, and getting them out of a situation that had spiraled too far. "Lead the way," Jason said, his voice steady despite the chaos churning inside him. They moved swiftly, every step calculated, their eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. Ben led them through a narrow hallway, the concrete walls cold and unwelcoming. Margot kept a few paces behind, her eyes darting between the darkened spaces, always alert. Jason could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. The stakes were higher than ever. One wrong move, and everything could come crashing down. They reached a heavy metal door at the end of the hallway, its surface scratched and dented from years of use. Ben stopped in front of it, his hand shaking slightly as he reached for the door handle. "Emma's in there," he said quietly. "She's locked in a room, but there's another door on the other side. We can slip out that way if we're quick." Jason nodded, his grip tightening on the gun concealed under his jacket. Margot glanced at him, a silent communication passing between them. They were ready. Ben took a deep breath and pushed open the door, the hinges creaking in protest. The room inside was dimly lit, a single overhead bulb flickering weakly. Emma sat on a chair in the center of the room, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. When she saw Ben, her expression shifted to one of relief and confusion. "Ben," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" "We're getting you out of here," Ben said urgently, rushing to her side. He knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "We don't have much time. Drake's men—" "Shh!" Emma cut him off, glancing nervously toward the door. "I heard them talking. They're coming back soon. You have to go. You all have to get out of here." "We're not leaving without you," Jason said firmly. "Get up. We're taking you both out of here." Emma hesitated, her gaze flickering to Ben before she nodded. She stood, her legs shaky but determined. She wasn't going to let fear control her any longer. Margot gestured toward the back of the room, where the second door Ben had mentioned was located. "We'll take the back exit. We need to move fast." Ben nodded, his grip still tight on Emma's hand. They all moved silently, stepping lightly across the cold concrete floor. As they reached the back door, Ben paused, his eyes flicking to the hallway beyond. "There's a guard out there. We'll need to take him down quietly." Jason signaled to Margot, who was already positioning herself to handle the situation. Margot moved like a shadow, slipping into the hallway with cat-like agility. Within seconds, there was a muffled sound, a brief struggle, and then silence. Margot returned, her expression unchanged. "Guards down, let's go." Jason led the way through the door, his eyes scanning every inch of the corridor. They were so close now, but the danger was far from over. They still had to navigate their way through the labyrinth of corridors, out of the building and into safety. Jason could feel the weight of every step, knowing that at any moment, Drake's men could catch wind of their escape and come after them. Ben's voice broke the silence. "We need to head toward the back parking lot. There's a van parked behind the building. It's the only way out." Jason nodded, pushing forward, his mind racing with plans and contingencies. They couldn't risk being spotted, couldn't afford to make any noise. If they were lucky, they'd make it out before anyone realized they were gone. As the van rumbled through the streets, Jason's mind was a whirlpool of thoughts, each one more frantic than the last. The weight of Drake's final words echoed in his mind, threatening to undo the momentary calm they'd gained. "You'll regret all of this." He clenched his fists, eyes fixed on the road ahead as the cityscape blurred past them. Emma and Ben were silent, the fear still gripping their expressions, though their breathing had steadied. Margot sat next to him, her sharp eyes scanning the rearview mirror as if expecting trouble to follow at any moment. "So, what now?" Margot asked, her voice low but urgent. Jason's jaw tightened. "We need to regroup, fast, but we can't stop moving. If Drake's right, we've just put a target on our backs." Emma, who had been silent until now, spoke up, her voice shaky but defiant. What if he's bluffing? What if he doesn't really have— "Don't underestimate him," Jason interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension. "He's dangerous, and now we've got no choice but to keep pushing forward." Margot turned to Emma. "It's not about what we hope, it's about what we know. Drake has connections. If he says there's more coming, we need to prepare for it." Jason glanced at Ben in the rearview mirror, noticing the young man's uneasy posture. He was on edge, and Jason couldn't blame him. Everything had spiraled out of control so quickly. His entire life, his family, his future, felt like it was hanging by a fragile thread, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold it together. "So, what's the play?" Margot asked again, her voice sharper now, as though she had read his thoughts. Jason took a deep breath. "We need intel. We need to know what Drake's planning. And we need leverage, something he wants, something we can use to make him back off." They drove in silence for a while longer, the sound of the tires on the asphalt, the only noise filling the space. Jason's thoughts drifted back to the conversation with Margot earlier, how the pieces had begun to come together. If Drake had someone in his corner, someone with more power than even he had, then Jason's only option was to play the game smarter. He couldn't fight it head-on. That would be suicide. When they reached the outskirts of town, Jason instructed Margot to pull over by a dilapidated warehouse on the corner. The place was tucked away from the main roads, the kind of spot that screamed low-level criminals or people who didn't want to be found. They needed a temporary hideout, somewhere they could gather their thoughts, plan their next move. "Stay close," Jason instructed Emma and Ben as they stepped out of the van. "If anyone follows us here, we'll need to be ready." Inside the warehouse, they found some semblance of safety, at least for the time being. Jason quickly scouted the area, checking for any signs of surveillance, any hint that someone might be watching them. When he was satisfied, he sat on a stack of old crates, pulling out his phone. "It's time," he muttered to himself, his fingers hovering over the screen. Margot raised an eyebrow as she watched him. "You're really going to do it, aren't you?" Jason nodded grimly. "I don't have a choice. If Drake's been watching me, watching us, we need to get one step ahead." He made the call. The phone rang a few times before a voice on the other end picked up. Jason. It was Elena. His old friend, the tech expert who'd helped him out of more than one tight situation. He could always count on her for things that weren't exactly legal, but always effective. "What do you need?" "I've got a problem," Jason said, his voice low. "Drake's made his move. He's got people, and I'm not sure if he's acting alone. We need to know who's backing him. We need to track his movements, his connections." "I'll get started," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the urgency. "I'll find the data you need. Just sit tight, Jason." He hung up the phone and turned back to Margot, who was still standing by the door, eyes scanning their surroundings. "She's on it," he said, trying to sound confident. "It's just a matter of time before we know who's pulling the strings." Margot crossed her arms, her gaze never wavering. "Time is the one thing we don't have." Jason didn't respond. Instead, he took a deep breath and turned to Emma and Ben. "Listen," he said, his voice softer now. "I know you're scared, but we can't stop. Not now. We're getting through this. Together." Emma nodded slowly, her expression still tight with worry. Ben, on the other hand, seemed lost in thought, his mind somewhere far off. Jason couldn't blame him. This wasn't how anyone expected their life to turn out, not like this. Just then, Jason's phone buzzed again. He picked it up, seeing Elena's name flash on the screen. "Already?" He muttered to himself, answering the call. "What have you got?" "Elena here." Her voice came through, crackling slightly. "I've found something. But it's not good, Jason. It's not just Drake you need to worry about." Minutes felt like hours as they waited for the intel. Jason's mind couldn't stop spinning. The deeper he got into this, the more it felt like he was falling down a rabbit hole, one that twisted and turned with more secrets, more lies, and a much bigger threat than he had anticipated. He kept replaying Elena's words in his mind. John Archer. Ruthless. Margot paced, too, occasionally glancing at her phone, her body language tense but controlled. Ben and Emma sat quietly, their faces etched with concern. Then, finally, Margot's phone buzzed again. She shot Jason a quick look, her eyes sharp. "It's him!" She quickly opened the message, scanning it with the intensity of someone who had done this before. Archer's schedule is tight. He's meeting with someone tonight, someone important, not a business contact. There's a location, a building on the east side of the city. Looks like a safe house. Jason's pulse quickened. Safe house. That wasn't a good sign. "How long?" he asked, stepping toward her, his mind already racing with plans. "An hour," Margot replied. "Maybe a little more." Jason didn't hesitate. "We need to be there before he meets whoever he's meeting with. We can't afford to be late." She nodded and immediately began gathering her things. "I'll drive. Let's move." The four of them quickly filed out of the warehouse and into Margot's car, the tension thick in the air. The city streets blurred past them as Margot navigated the way with practiced ease, her eyes darting occasionally to the rearview mirror. Jason leaned back in his seat, his mind still reeling from the implications. If Archer was meeting someone important, it meant whatever was going on was much bigger than just Drake. The stakes had escalated from personal to something far more dangerous. The thought of what they might uncover tonight sent a chill down his spine. The building loomed ahead, an unremarkable structure tucked away in an industrial area. There were no windows, no signs of life. A perfect place to keep secrets. Margot parked the car a few blocks away, out of sight of the building, and the group disembarked, moving quickly but quietly. They kept to the shadows, the night air cool against their skin. "We need to get eyes." "On the inside," Jason whispered, his voice low but intense. "No mistakes." Margot led the way, her movements stealthy as she approached the back of the building. They found a narrow alley that ran alongside it, leading to a small service door. Margot motioned for them to stop, then crouched down to inspect the lock. "I've got this," she said, pulling out a set of tools. Jason kept watch, his senses on high alert. Everything felt wrong, too quiet, too controlled. His thoughts kept flicking to the people they might find inside. If Archer's involved, who else is here? Margot's quiet voice broke through his thoughts. "It's open." The door creaked slightly as they slipped inside, the faint hum of the building's electrical system the only sound. The air inside was musty, and Jason immediately felt the weight of the silence around them. They moved quickly through the hallways, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting. There was a faint glow of light coming from a door at the far end of the hallway. Jason motioned for the group to stop, holding up his hand. They crouched low, listening intently. From the other side of the door came voices, low, urgent whispers. Jason couldn't make out the words, but the tension in the voices was unmistakable. "Ready?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margot gave a slight nod. "On your lead." Jason took a deep breath, his hand on the door handle. This was it. The moment they'd been working toward. He glanced at Margot, Ben, and Emma, their faces grim but determined. With a swift motion, Jason pushed the door open. Inside, a dimly lit room. A man sat at a table, his back to them. Jason's eyes locked onto him. It was John Archer. And sitting across from him, speaking in low tones, was someone Jason hadn't expected to see, Elena. A sharp breath caught in Jason's throat. His mind raced to piece together the puzzle, but it didn't make sense. Why was Elena here? How was she involved with Archer? Before anyone could react, Elena glanced up, her eyes locking with Jason's. The air in the room seemed to freeze, as if time itself had stopped. "Elena," Jason said, his voice strained with disbelief. "What the hell is going on?" She stood slowly, her expression unreadable. "Jason, Don't," he interrupted, his voice rising. "I don't know what this is, but you've got some explaining to do." Archer stood as well, his calm demeanor almost chilling. "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Carter. You've already crossed a line." Jason's heart pounded in his chest, every instinct telling him to act, to move. But Elena's voice stopped him cold. "Jason, it's not what you think," she said, her tone quiet but firm. "I'm doing this to protect you." Jason's eyes narrowed. "Protect me? By working with him?" He gestured toward Archer. Jason's mind raced as the words echoed in his ears. Too late for what? The confusion, the mounting sense of dread, it was all crashing together in a way that felt too overwhelming to grasp fully. He stood frozen, the weight of Archer's words, sinking into him like a stone. Elena took a cautious step forward, her eyes never leaving Jason's. There was something in her gaze, something that spoke volumes despite her silence. She was hiding something. No, more than one thing. "Elena," Jason said, his voice low but edged with anger. "What deal? What the hell is going on?" Archer chuckled darkly, his cold eyes assessing Jason as if he were an insignificant piece on a chessboard. "You really have no idea, do you?" His voice was smooth, like a well-rehearsed performance. "This isn't about you, Carter. It's about power. Money. Things much bigger than your little life." Jason's heart pounded. His breath came in shallow bursts as he tried to understand what was being laid out before him. The realization hit him with a brutal clarity. Elena wasn't just working with Archer. She was in this. She was a part of it. But why? She stood there, silent, her eyes pleading with him, but there was no way to read her anymore. The woman he'd trusted, the woman who was supposed to be carrying his child, she was tied up in something far darker than he could have ever imagined. The silence in the room stretched out, thick and suffocating, until Elena finally spoke. "I didn't want you involved. I wanted to keep you safe from all of this," she said softly, her voice trembling ever so slightly. Jason's fists clenched at his sides. "Safe? How? By keeping secrets? By betraying me? This is how you keep me safe." She winced at the venom in his words, but stood her ground. "It wasn't supposed to go like this, Jason. We were trying to control the situation. I thought I could keep you out of it. But now we've reached the point of no return." Jason took a step toward her, his voice hoarse. "We? Who else is involved, Elena? Who else is in this? What's going on here?" Archer, leaning casually against the wall, finally spoke again, his voice dripping with malice. "You're asking the wrong questions, Mr. Carter. The question you should be asking is why you didn't notice the cracks in your little life sooner. Your wife isn't the only one keeping secrets, but you'll learn soon enough. We all will." Jason's heart skipped a beat. The implications of his words were terrifying, but the worst part was the deepening feeling of betrayal that had already set in. He turned back to Elena, eyes wide with disbelief. "What's he talking about? What are you really involved in?" Her lips trembled, but she didn't look away. "Jason, you need to listen to me. Please." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "There are people watching us. People who have been watching us for a while. This is bigger than you and me." Jason felt a sharp sting in his chest. He could feel the walls closing in, the ground shifting beneath him. He had been so sure of Elena, so certain she was the one person he could trust in this world. And now, everything was a lie. "Who, Elena? Who's watching us?" Jason asked, through clenched teeth, his voice barely a whisper. "The syndicate," she said, the words falling from her lips like a curse. The people who control everything, the money, the power, it's all connected, Jason. The affair, the pregnancy. It was never about us. It was never real. Jason stared at her, unable to process what he was hearing. The syndicate? What does that even mean? You're telling me that everything was a game? She nodded slowly, the anguish in her eyes unmistakable. I tried to stop it, Jason. I tried to protect you, but I couldn't. I couldn't keep you safe. Not from them. Archer straightened, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. You see, Elena, the truth always comes out. Always. Jason felt the weight of it all. His mind was swirling. His breath was shallow. Every word Elena spoke felt like it was tearing apart the life he thought he knew. The deal. What was it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper, desperate to understand. Elena's eyes flickered briefly to Archer, before looking back at Jason. They wanted leverage. They were going to use you against me. I had no choice but to play along. Jason took a step back, the pieces slowly falling into place. Leverage? Against you? And me? Why? Because you're a threat, Jason, Archer answered, pushing himself off the wall. You've been poking around places you shouldn't, asking the wrong questions. It's all connected. The power moves we've been making, it's all tied to you now. Jason felt a chill spread through him. He was just a pawn in a much bigger game, a game that had been rigged long before he even realized he was involved. Elena was a part of it. But why? What did she owe them? Before he could ask. More, Elena spoke again, her voice breaking. I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you. The barrel of the gun gleamed in the dim light, its cold, metal surface reflecting the tension in the room. Jason's heartbeat quickened, the weight of the situation sinking in with terrifying clarity. He glanced at Elena, her face pale, her lips trembling as the men in suits approached. Elena, what the hell is going on? Jason's voice was low, almost a growl. His mind raced, trying to process everything in an instant. He could feel his pulse thundering in his ears. One of the men, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he focused on Jason. You've been asking too many questions, Carter. You should have stayed out of this. Jason's instincts kicked in. He had no plan, no strategy, but he couldn't just stand there and let things spiral out of control, not without a fight. Listen, I don't know what this is about, but I'm not going down without a damn good reason. Jason snapped, his voice rising as he took a step toward the men. His eyes flickered to Elena. You better start talking. Right now. The second man, shorter, with sharp features, gave a slight nod to his companion. No more games, Carter, he said coldly, taking another step forward. Your wife's involvement is unfortunate, but the deal's already been made. Your questions are irrelevant. Jason's gut clenched. Unfortunate. That was the word they were using for the woman he thought he knew. The woman who was carrying his child. The woman who had been lying to him all along. Elena, I trusted you. I loved you, Jason said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. And this is how you repay me? By being a part of this nightmare? Elena's eyes glistened with unshed tears, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason, please. I didn't have a choice. I wanted to protect you, but they forced my hand. Enough. The first man barked, cutting her off. His hand reached for his belt, pulling out a set of handcuffs. You'll have plenty of time to explain once we're done here. Jason's mind was a blur. He needed to act. His body moved before his brain had fully processed it, his hand shooting out to grab the arm of the man closest to him. In a split second, he threw his weight forward, sending the man stumbling back. The second man reacted instantly, raising his gun, but Jason was faster. He knocked the weapon to the side, sending it clattering to the ground. His pulse surged with adrenaline, But before he could make another move, the first man tackled him to the floor, the air knocked from his lungs in a harsh gasp. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the first man growled, his weight pressing Jason's body into the cold floor. Jason struggled, trying to free himself, but the man's grip was like iron. Elena screamed, the sound raw and desperate, but it was drowned out by the sound of the second man picking up his gun. "No!" Elena shouted, her voice cracking as she took a hesitant step toward the men. "Please don't hurt him. He doesn't know anything. He's just trying to protect me." The first man glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You should have thought about that before you got involved, Elena. Now your mistakes are his problems." Jason's mind raced. He couldn't let them take him. Not like this. Not without knowing the full truth of what had happened. He needed to get out, to survive, to make sure Elena couldn't pull him deeper into this mess. He lashed out, kicking the man on top of him in the shin with all the force he could muster. The man grunted, momentarily loosening his hold just long enough for Jason to break free and scramble to his feet. He grabbed a nearby chair, hurling it at the man with the gun. The chair slammed into the man's chest, sending him crashing into the wall. Jason didn't wait to see if the man would recover. He turned on his heel, bolting toward the door, heart pounding as the sound of footsteps behind him grew louder. He had to escape. He had to find answers. "Elena!" he yelled over his shoulder, panic rising in his chest. "Come on! We're getting out of here!" But Elena didn't move. She was frozen in place, her eyes locked on the two men still standing. Jason's heart sank as he realized she wasn't coming. She was already too far gone, too deep into whatever dark world had ensnared her. He could feel the gravity of her betrayal pulling them both down, like quicksand. The first man, recovering from the chair attack, lunged at Jason, grabbing him by the shoulder and spinning him around. The force of the motion sent Jason crashing into the wall. Pain shot through his ribs as he gasped for breath. "You're not going anywhere," the man said with a cold smile, not without answers. Jason's vision swam as the room tilted, the sound of his own heartbeat deafening in his ears. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep fighting. He had no plan, no backup, and now Elena was gone. She had already chosen her side. "Tell me what's going on," Jason spat, his voice strained. Jason's breath came in ragged bursts as he ran, his legs moving faster than he thought possible, the sound of approaching sirens growing louder behind him. His mind, still racing from the confrontation, barely registered the dark alleys and quiet streets he dashed through. The cold night air stung his lungs, but the adrenaline coursing through him dulled the pain. He couldn't afford to stop, not with the men in suits and Elena's twisted part in everything. His thoughts kept circling back to her, her frozen expression, the way she had watched him run, as if she had made her choice. Was she a prisoner too? Or was she a willing participant in all of this? Suddenly, his foot caught on an uneven curb, and he stumbled. He barely caught himself, but the brief moment of hesitation was enough to make him look over his shoulder. The street was empty, save for the distant flash of blue and red lights. His heart pounded harder in his chest, knowing that those flashing lights weren't for him. They were for something far darker, something that would catch up to him soon enough. Jason darted into a narrow alley, his thoughts churning like a storm. He didn't know where he was headed, only that he couldn't go back. Not to Elena, not to the men. He had to figure out what was happening, what he was tangled in, and if he still had a chance to make things right. But can I? He thought bitterly. Can I even trust myself? A sharp, sudden noise cut through the silence of the alley, followed by the unmistakable scrape of boots on concrete. Jason froze. His heart raced as the sound drew nearer, too deliberate, too controlled to be the police. The men were closing in. But why had they stopped chasing him directly? He pressed himself into the shadowed corner of the alley, trying to steady his breath, but his chest was tight with panic. Then a voice, low and steady, floated toward him from the end of the alley. "Jason, you're not going to get away from this," the voice said, smooth and menacing. It was the voice of the man who had been closest to him, the one he'd fought back in the room. Jason's pulse quickened. He stepped silently behind a dumpster, praying that they wouldn't notice. The fresh set of footprints leading deeper into the alley. His mind raced as he tried to listen for any sign of the man's movements. "I know you're out here," the voice continued, closer now. "I know you're trying to run, but the truth is, you've already been caught." Jason's eyes darted. Around, searching for anything at all, that might offer a way out. A door. A window. Anything. Then, to his surprise, the voice softened, almost as if in resignation. "You really thought you could escape? This isn't a game, Jason. It never was." The sound of footsteps halted, just feet away. Jason's heart seemed to stop in his chest. He had no more moves left, no more tricks up his sleeve. And then, just as the night seemed to suffocate him, a crackling sound echoed from his phone. It was the message from Elena, the one he never opened. Jason's hand shot to his pocket, almost instinctively, before his fingers gripped the phone. His stomach churned with dread as he unlocked it. The message read, "I'm sorry, but I can't. Keep lying to you. There's more to this than I ever told you. You need to get to the old warehouse on Sycamore Street. They'll be there."